All right, 5 seconds.
Good evening, everybody, or excuse me, afternoon or morning or wherever it is that you may be. If you're in space watching us, you might be passing over India and then all of a sudden in China, and perhaps you're passing over the Pacific, which is of course the topic of our lectures this evening. So those of you who have joined us, thank you so much. It truly is an honor to be a part of the Women's Committee. We've been doing quite a few events this year, some of which you may have seen. This event is, I think, the 5th official event that's celebrating 40 years of women members in the club. And of course, tonight's program is called Women of the Pacific. We have an incredible lineup this evening of women who I have truly enjoyed seeking out and then getting to know as best we can over Zoom over the past couple of months to put this program together. So before we start, I would of course like to shout out to our fearless leader, as we like to call her, Milbury Polk, for bringing us all together and being the willing member to guide us as the 40th anniversary committee when former President Richard Weiss came up with this brilliant idea. So first, a major shout out to Milbury Polk and everything that she's done for us. I also want to thank Kevin Murphy, because without him, we would not be here streaming on Facebook and YouTube and on explorers.org. Will Roseman, of course, the man who is really in charge of everything. No offense to past and current president, Richard and Richard, but thanks to them as well for an amazing effort and presence that they present the world with for the face of the Explorers Club. So thank you, Richard Weiss and Richard Garriott. Brittany, what would we do without you? And I want to thank the Women's Committee as well, Lacey and Nancy Nino and Dave Dolan, who at the 11th hour were helpful in finding Emily and Amber, whom you'll hear from this evening. And finally, I want to thank Dr. Wade Davis for really at the 11th, 9.99 hour finding us Dr. Elizabeth Lindsey, who is with us tonight. So thank you to all you wonderful people who've helped make this come together. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself and why hopefully it'll make sense that Milbury asked me to host this evening for the Women of the Pacific. So speaking of the Pacific, as we all know, the Pacific Ocean is the largest of the now 5 official oceans on the Earth. The Pacific is 63.8 million square miles, which means that there's a whole lot going on in this particular ocean. So as you will see once I turn the program over to our special speakers this evening, everybody comes from very different angles regarding their work in the Pacific. And I think it's really, it's going to be a really interesting lineup tonight. So Milbury asked me to host this evening's program as she knows how passionate I am about most everything to do with the Pacific. As a filmmaker, I've had the good fortune to participate in a number of Explorers Club expeditions and to tell many stories throughout Polynesia. Whether it's been searching off of Oahu for sunken submarines or off American Samoa for downed aircraft, to running DNA studies with the elders of Rapa Nui, or to archaeological digs in the Marquesas. Those experiences have been incredibly meaningful to me and some of the most rewarding. But I do have a particular fondness for ancient wayfinding and how the Polynesian origin stories can tell us so much about these incredible societies and how they voyage to tiny specks of land across the largest ocean on Earth. One of the most exciting experiences I've ever had was voyaging with Nainoa Thompson and others from the Pacific Voyaging Society throughout the Hawaiian Islands on Hokulea, and then taking that knowledge to resurrect and sail an ancient style canoe with local Marquesans off their particular home island of Hivaoa. These are just some of my meaningful expeditions across the vast Pacific. But without further ado, I turn the evening over to our fascinating guests, whose backgrounds, stories, and work is as varied as the Pacific Islands themselves. Our first guest is Captain Lynn Danaher. And I'll give a short intro for each one of these incredible women, but I would really prefer the time be spent with them speaking to you about their own amazing stories. But in short, I will introduce Captain Lynn Danaher. She has been a very, very active Explorers Club member since joining as a fellow in 2005, I believe. She's worked across the Pacific for over 2 decades, been on 5 flag expeditions, and traveled, to all 7 continents. She's president of the Pacific Islands Research Institute, which is dedicated to the study, understanding, and preservation of the unique cultural heritage and fragile environment of the islands of the Pacific Ocean. So with that, I will let her tell you her story, which includes upcoming expeditions to Pitcairn Island and back to Nan Madol in Micronesia. So Lynn, it's your turn. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right, I'm here. And thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And I've been a member since 2005. And I had the amazing luck working for Lindblad Expeditions. I went to Easter Island in 2004, and I met Edmundo Edwards on Rapa Nui or Easter Island. And he and I became good friends, and we decided to start the Pacific Islands Research Institute so we could join forces with members of the Explorers Club and friends and supporters and visit these islands in the Pacific and continue his extensive research that he has done. He actually completely surveyed the entire island of Rapa Nui. It's astounding accomplishment, as well as multiple other types of research that he's done, and in the Marquesas in Tahiti. And one of the reasons I'm sharing this short video with you is because this kind of sums up the intention of what we do. For some reason, it's not working now, Kevin. Well, we practiced and practiced, and unfortunately, it's not working. For some reason, the video's not working. But basically, what he says, oh, there it went. Sorry about that. It took a while to load. Apology. Bear with us.
No worries, Lynn. Take your time. It probably does take a load.
What's fascinating about this particular film clip is it's from a CBC documentary called Story and Stone. And I don't know why it's not loading. We practice, so. Anyway, what basically he says in his, in that particular clip, and I'm gonna go back, is because the people of This Is Raivavai in the Oslo group, they really don't know enough about their history. What he basically states is all they have to learn is the Bible, because that's all that matters. And so a lot of the people in these remote islands that we visit, especially in the Oslo group, for instance, they don't really know anything about their culture, their past culture. So our idea was to go learn what we could and share with them what we could. And here is a example. These are all places we've been across the Pacific. 7 expeditions across Oceania from Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia is our main focal point. We were in the Raivavai in 2006, and we went again in 2015, and we were measuring the archaeological sites. In 2016, we were doing them by hand because we didn't have GPS. We were measuring these monstrous stones that they moved into place. And then in 2015, we found we had the right equipment to actually get our alignments proper. And we were able to determine that Antares is the zenith star of the Auster group. We also discovered this red scoria tiki head, which was extraordinary. And of course, we carried the flag of the Explorers Club. In Easter Island and Rapa Nui in 2010, I went there primarily to study the lesser stone structures. Everybody thinks of Moai when they think of Easter Island, but there's a lot of other structures. Here's, I'm gonna go back just one sec here. This is called a Tupa, and this Tupa is a, basically the astronomer priests lived in this Tupa, and they were the ones that conducted all the measurements as to when the stars rose and set and when it was time to harvest and fish. And this particular entrance was facing the rising of the Pleiades. And this is the, this right here is an aerial, which is, hang on, sorry. This aerial is Manavai and the foundation of the Easter Island people. This is what you call a Haripanga, which was their foundation for their structures, which were covered with sticks and grasses in the shape of a canoe, which I always found interesting. Manavai is where they protected their plants because they built these stone structures around them to protect them from the windswept country of Easter Island. And the most sacred of all, the Harimoa, which was for the chickens. And this one, I just want to, the chickens lived in that, went through that little puka in that stone building. And that's where they were kept. And they were kept for their eggs, their meat, but their feathers were extraordinarily important for decoration. This is a Pipi Harico, which was on a north-south alignment and lined up with several others of the on Easter Island, so we could actually measure and take accurate measurements. There was one directly behind me and one directly in front of me, so the alignments were really. So that's what we were doing, was verifying the alignments. Also, there was in 2010 a full eclipse of the sun, and I saw, these are two Chileans, friends of mine. Anyway, this is in the Marquesas. We did in 2013, we did a rock art condition survey. So we visited all the known sites, and we to survey the condition of the sites and also record the petroglyphs in Hatuhu Valley. One of the things that I really enjoyed doing was in Kosharai in Ponape, which is Micronesia. One of my goals in life was to see these islands. And so we were in Kosharai, which was a beautiful island, and we hiked up a big steep valley, went to a place called Menke, which was an ancient site, and learned all about the vegetation and anyway, here's our group. Sorry, I didn't realize these slides were going to go quite this fast. This is our group on the hike up to Menke. And the reason why going to Menke was so important is Menke is an extremely ancient site, far, far older than Leilu, which we had actually came to see. But the only way to get to Menke was to go up this valley. It was quite a long hike. And this is Menke. So it's really just stacked stones, but there were many of them in a row. And there were platform upon platform upon platform staggered up this entire hillside. And at the very top of this hillside was this odd stone, which had a face in it. And it was a sacred stone. It's red scoria, which the Polynesians all believe, or Micronesians believe, are sacred. This is Leilu. And what's fascinating about Leilu is you can see the difference in Leilu, because you've got these really stacked stones, and they're basically, it's columnar basalt that they would mine and haul to these locations for sacred sites, all on a reef. These are all built on a reef. This is the quarry that we were able to locate. You can see the stones in the hillside. And this was Namandal. And Namandal was an extraordinary place, and our intention there was to measure the alignments of these particular sites. And there are 92 man-made structures. And I want to point out the seawall on the outside of this particular map, because we were able to locate a seawall and got a measurement on it right there with our app. So this was in 2017, and it was an astounding place. If anybody ever wants to go there, it's just astounding. I mean, you can't believe that they were able to do what they did. This shows the alignments of the walls, now north, south, and east, west. They were really, really accurate, and it was quite surprising. Okay, now, and what I really like about this particular picture is it shows the uptick. The legend is that these folks came from Taiwan, and there's an Asian influence in the way these things are built. This right is significant, and I'm going to go back because this is important. When you look through this puka right here, this hole in the side of the wall, on the other side is another wall. And if you look through this wall, this was something we discovered while we were taking our measurements, to the other hole in the wall on the other side, right through the middle of it was the rising of Polaris. We were able to actually get that measurement of Polaris on the opposite side. This is the opposite side of that particular wall. Exploring Namandal is amazing because you have all of these hidden walls within the mangrove themselves. So the only way to get around really is by kayak. And so it was really, it's like they call it the Venice of the Pacific, because the entire structure is built out on a reef. These massive columnar basalt structures are built on the top of a reef just offshore of a volcanic island. So it's pretty extraordinary. Just the architectural accomplishment of this particular site is astounding. And the good news is it's now part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So of course we always carry the flag when we can. And I love this picture of Julie and Alex Wallace. It was their Christmas card one year. Now, what was really interesting about this site is this particular site in the middle of Namandal was fresh water. And the reason why that's significant is because it's this massive structure out in the middle of on a reef, and there was still fresh water. And this was one of the sacred sites in Namandal. And this was one of the last days I was there. So because there was fresh water in the middle of the structure, in the middle of this reef, I came up with a hypothesis, because there's tons of water pouring off the volcanic island. And so I'll go back to my hypothesis. What's fascinating about this is this particular petroglyph that we located had an absolute perfect north-south axis. It was, and then Jeannie, I don't know how many of you know Jeannie in New York, but what she did, I love this about her, is she went to all of her veterinarian friends while in New York and collected all their outdated medicines and worming medicines and brought it here to Ponape and distributed it to the local veterinarians. And with the other thing we always do when we travel, which I didn't put pictures in, but we always carry an AED, an artillery defibrillator, and we always contribute one of those to every village or island that we visit. So we did dedicate one to Ponape, we gave one to Raivabai, and we've also given one to Easter Island. So that's just something that I think is important for people to do, is contribute to the places that they visit in some form or another. So my hypothesis was that there's fresh water in Namandal, fresh water available. And I've done, this is an aerial survey of possible places that I think there is fresh water that's intruding up into the site. And as a result, I plan to go back there to actually test the water. And this is a great example of how fresh water lays on top of limestone and salt water. So my plan is to return to Namandal and test the water with just do some salinity testing, because the myth is, wait a minute, let me stop here. The myth is that everyone abandoned Amundal because they had no fresh water. And I don't believe that that's true. I think there was plenty of fresh water. So I want to further explore why they abandoned the site. I believe it was due to warfare or disease. And that's the first step. The first step is proving that they had fresh water. So, and then explore further the other reasons why the site was abandoned. Pitcairn is another island that we plan to visit in the future. Of course, everybody's heard of Pitcairn. Lots of PR about the actual Bounty mutiny, but what we plan to do is we will be actually excavating the bones of the mutineers themselves and testing them for DNA. Pitcairn is a really, really difficult place to get to. It's very remote. In this particular image, you can see how far it is. It's a 32-hour boat ride from the Gambier Islands, which you have to fly to from Tahiti to get to Pitcairn. And it's really a tricky spot to get to. So we're planning to go there in 22 or 23. We have applied for the permits for that, and we're just awaiting that permission. The Pitcairn Islanders themselves are pretty amazing folks. There's only 52 on the island. The other thing that Pacific Islands Research Institute has done is we have been the sponsor of a documentary film festival. We've also built a planetarium on Easter Island, and we're currently building an observatory on Easter Island. So there's a lot of things you can do with a nonprofit in the Pacific, as long as you have good support and interested parties to be engaged with. So there you go. That's my summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Can you all hear me all right?
Yep.
There we go. Thank you so much for that. As you know, and as I've expressed here in my opening statement, I'm so passionate about anything having to do with the Pacific, and I definitely have a place in my heart for Rapa Nui, and I can't wait to join your expeditions to Micronesia and Pitcairn, just in case you haven't heard your film crew yet. Just saying, just saying. So thank you so much for that. We will have some questions for you, during our Q&A. So don't go too far from us. And in the meantime, I would like to introduce our next speakers who come to us as a team. We are about to hear from Emily Hazelwood and Amber Sparks, who met during their graduate program at Scripps. The two of them co-founded Blue Latitudes, which is a certified woman-owned small business and a marine environmental consulting firm. Through this firm, they work to unite science, policy, and communications to help solve ecological challenges, predominantly in the Pacific, although I do believe they work anywhere worldwide. They are based in La Jolla, San Diego areas. They also founded the Blue Latitudes Foundation that seeks out opportunities for conservation at the intersection of industry and environment. Both Emily and Amber were recognized by Forbes in 2018 on the prestigious 30 Under 30 group in the energy sector. Emily is a marine conservation biologist, an environmental consultant, and an entrepreneur. And Amber is an oceanographer, environmental scientist, and entrepreneur. So today, what I'm very excited to share with you all is that they are going to tell us about a recent expedition to Tonga at a very, very, very pivotal time of the year for wildlife in the oceans of that area. So I will turn it over now to Emily and Amber.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. We are so honored to be here today on this exceptional panel of women in the oceans and women of the Pacific. And today we'll be sharing a story about swimming with humpback whales and exploring ecotourism in the Kingdom of Tonga, an amazing expedition that we were fortunate enough to do a couple years ago. And we'll start with a quick trailer of our documentary film.
Em fui for kau pe dia ko fui me fo o yo. Ko ha o mo kau parang ya kau mo to fo a. Ka ko tem ko na mo finga lo to dai mo finga mo to dia. Ni wa ka pe to fa na mai ke mo ai kau pe ho ka e.
More people come here for photographer and stuff like that, and they're trying to harass the whale, So I'm watching pretty much if they can stop the licensing, just cut it down, try to make it less.
I can probably say there are too many licenses, all right? There are too many licenses at present, and I think there's also issues because most of the whale watching licenses are foreign owned. Very few is owned by Tongans.
Apa means respect in Tongan. And we decided to name our film that because what we found is that this is a really unique community in Tonga that taught us a lot about what it means to respect our environment. As a brief introduction, Emily and I are co-presidents of the Blue Latitudes Foundation. We work to elevate the traditional concepts of ocean stewardship by uniting government, industry, and the community to work together towards conserving our oceans. We've been known to work primarily on repurposing offshore oil and gas platforms into artificial reefs, but we do a lot more than just that. We've also had this really unique opportunity to explore how ecotourism plays a function in local communities. Our trip to Tonga was an incredible expedition because Tonga is a really unique place where humpback whales travel every year to give birth to their young, like this young calf here. It's a safe haven. It's an incredible nursery ground for these incredible species. And it's one of the few places where you can actually get in the water with these animals and get up close and personal with them. As you can see, our guide here is getting eye to eye with this massive animal. Now, granted, this is the baby, so you should see the mom lurking in the depths beneath. It was truly an incredible experience to get in the water. Right now, you can see it gets a little bit close to our photographer, gives a quick little pat hello, one of the closest encounters of the trip.
The Kingdom of Tonga is found off the coast, far off the coast of Australia. You can get there via Fiji, which is how we flew in. And the island that we stayed on was the island group of Vava'u. Now, Tonga consists of nearly 170 islands, most of which are actually uninhabited, and they're broken into 3 main groups. We found ourselves on the island of Vava'u, and we stayed with a local Tongan family that ran a small ecotourism operation off one of the islands there. The Kingdom of Tonga, or the Kingdom of Whales, has a long history with their humpback whales. However, it was one that before the 1970s was mostly focused around hunting these whales. Now, although they did eat humpback whale meat, it was principally used in that that was their way of getting income. They would slaughter the whales and then sell them for the oil and the meat, although they did consume the whales. And it wasn't until the 1970s when the king of Tonga at that time actually heard a recording of some of the whales singing. And this was at a time when the environmental movement was picking up steam in the United States and elsewhere around the world. And it was subsequently Tonga banned the hunting of whales in the late 1970s.
But today, they no longer hunt the whales. Rather, there is a generational shift towards ecotourism, where now the Tongan people are actually getting in the water with these whales and looking to preserve not only the species, but the environment in which they have their nursery grounds. And this is a really unique moment in time where you have this new generation of eco warriors that are still in community with the older grandparents who used to hunt the whales. So it was a really unique experience to have both of these generations together, learning about the whales and what these incredible species mean to that community. So this led us to better understanding what our purpose was there in Tonga. We were there to understand and explore this generational shift and assess this sustainability and profitability of ecotourism in Tonga. We also wanted to film our experience, and we made a documentary film, of course, Waka Apa Apa, that told the story of this generational shift.
As we all know, ecotourism can have a dark side. And so we traveled to Tonga to answer several questions to better understand how effective ecotourism operations were within the Vava'u Island group. We wanted to understand, is this practice sustainable? Meaning, was it something that was not negatively impacting the whales? Were we seeing folks chasing whales? Was there too many people in the water with the whales? Were they following regulations? You know, what was the relationship that the people of Tonga had with these whales, and how regulated was this industry? We also wanted to understand what the plastic pollution impacts were. We worked with Scripps Institution of Oceanography and Dr. Dimitri Dehane's lab to actually collect samples of the water in Tonga, for it was actually one of the few regions in the world where they actually didn't have any samples from the oceans there. We also wanted to understand, was this a profitable operation? In other words, were Tongans themselves actually benefiting, or was this something where there was foreign operators coming in and buying up most of the licenses? And that really became one of the pivotal questions of our documentary film, was learning about how very, very few of the operators that take you out with the whales are actually Tongan run.
Taking a closer look at what we did in the field, we also had the opportunity to do some acoustic sampling. So we were capturing those whale songs. It was a pretty incredible way to get some audio for our documentary film. As Emily mentioned, we were taking samples and looking at microfibers and microplastics in this pristine ocean environment. And this was a part of a bigger study with Dr. Dimitri's lab at Scripps. Lastly, we did some local surveys. We went and we spoke to the Tongan people directly. We were working with not only those who operated these tours every day, but we went and talked to some of the regulators, people at the Ministry of Tourism and Environment, to understand what their perspective was on ecotourism in Tonga. What was really interesting in terms of our microfiber sampling, looking at how these plastics were present in the water, was we actually found there was an average of 4 fibers per sample. Now, this is an incredibly remote area of our oceans where we were not expecting to see this many fibers per sample. Now, remember, microfibers are incredibly small. You can't see them from the naked eye, but they're relatively ubiquitous in our environment. They can be found in the fresh water on land, as well as throughout the Pacific. So this finding, we're currently working on publishing it with Dr. Dimitri's lab.
We also did an ecosystem health assessment, and part of our interest in doing this was understanding not only the relationship of the whales in Tonga, but how healthy were the coral ecosystems and the fisheries, were they sustainable in Tonga? And what we did was we gathered data from all of the island groups and selected a few control sites to measure fish richness, or the number of species of fish, as well as coral cover. And what we found is they were actually quite healthy ecosystems. There wasn't a presence, at least in the island group that we were evaluating, of overfishing or any sort of destructive dynamite fishing amongst the coral heads that we were evaluating.
Now, this was likely because increases in tourism in Tonga have been really gradual over the past 10, 20 years. Now, this stands in stark contrast to areas like Japan and New Zealand that have seen an exponential increase. But rather, the gradual increase in tourism pressure has likely resulted in a more sustainable use of the ocean resources, and has allowed the community and the environment to adapt to more people coming, ecotourism sort of picking up speed.
Well, the results of our assessment were not as clear-cut as we might have thought. Like any expedition and like any documentary film, you think you set out seeking to answer one set of questions, and very quickly you find yourself asking a whole new set of questions. Some of the opportunities that we identified in Tonga was that the increase in tourism was steady. It wasn't overflowing in the islands or growing unsustainably. It was actually very sustainably run. They also, we noted with our guides and with a lot of the other Tongan guides, really promoted whale conservation, and they were very restrictive with regards to preventing any sort of harassment with the whales, or determining, there is a cutoff time for how long you're able to be in the water with those whales, or if they determined there was too many boats on a whale, they were very restrictive in terms of the guidelines for swimming with the humpbacks. We also determined it provided a great source of low impact income. However, that was a double-edged sword, because the only other sources of income primarily in the islands of Tonga come from the production of vanilla as well as kava. So Tonga, in the form of ecotourism, did have an alternative, which was a great source for them. However, it's seasonal work. The whales are only in Tonga from about June till the end of October. All other seasons, the Tongans were finding themselves going, many young Tongans go offshore across the ocean to work in other countries. That seasonal work also was highly dependent on the whales returning. And that was a question we thought about a lot during the filming of our documentary was, well, what would happen one day if the whales don't come back? Tongan whales, they aren't there year round. It's a population of about 1,000 to 2,000 individuals, and they are migratory. So they're only in Tonga to breed and give birth. During the other seasons, they're traveling to their feeding grounds. Now, this was an interesting question, because at the time we were considering, well, what will happen if the whales don't come back? And then 1 year later, COVID hit, and we faced an entirely new question, was what happens if the people don't come back? What happens if ecotourism crashes? And in our conversations with many of the local Tongans that we'd worked with previously, it had had a significant impact on ecotourism, because not only were they not able to take folks out on whale tours, but also they weren't able to travel overseas to continue working. And it just demonstrated how fragile this one source of income was. One other constraint we noted was the presence of foreign licenses. Only a small percentage of the Tongan licenses issued to go swim with whales were actually owned by Tongans. It's an expensive business to get into. You need to have your own vessel as well as hire your own staff, which meant there was a lot of foreign investors coming in and purchasing foreign-owned licenses. And one thing that a lot of the local Tongans and regulators we were working with on the islands were working to change was changing that so that the majority of those licenses could be achieved by actual Tongans.
Looking forward, we did, of course, leave with a couple more questions about how can Tonga increase their tourism capacity while limiting their impact on the environment. Like Emily mentioned, what happens if the whales don't return, but what happens when the people don't return, and the impacts of COVID-19? These questions remain unanswered. We're still looking into this more, but the great thing is that we've been given the opportunity to share our research as well as our documentary film at multiple film festivals and get this conversation going. And we're hoping that it can be a catalyst for preservation and conservation of this incredible and unique ecosystem in Tonga moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber and Emily. That was just so fascinating, and I'm so jealous about your dives with those gorgeous, gorgeous creatures, and also so grateful for the science and the thought that you've put in towards a small kingdom such as Tonga, and how these kingdoms can move forward in a way that's beneficial to their populace and also to the environment surrounding them at the same time. So thank you again so much for that. And as I said to Lynn, please stick around because you know we're going to have Q&A after this. But before we do that, we have one more speaker this evening who, as I mentioned, came to us at the 11th hour and was a gift from Dr. Wade Davis, with whom I believe she's known for quite some time. Dr. Elizabeth Kapu'uwailani, and I maybe butchered that, I apologize if I did, but I practiced, whose other last name is Lindsay, is the first Polynesian explorer and female fellow in the history of National Geographic Society, which is truly an amazing feat. She is also native to Hawaii, where she was raised by Hawaiian elders, and today she's a cultural anthropologist and award-winning filmmaker. Dr. Lindsay's work and explorations have taken her beyond the Hawaiian Islands as a conservationist of indigenous wisdom, which I find so fascinating, based on what I have learned, what little I've learned, I'm sure in comparison to Dr. Lindsay, about origin stories and indigenous wisdom. She's also the founder of the Indigenous World Wisdom Collective, whose mission it is to create the first global digital repository for conservation of ancestral wisdom and knowledge. She advises global organizations, including the Tibet Fund for His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And now we get to hear from her directly. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Lindsay.
Devin, thank you for that beautiful introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be joining all of the women on this panel this evening. Aloha. Let me share my screen and we will begin.
Let me know if you want any guidance there, if it's not
functioning. Thank you. It's actually not functioning right now, but let me try one more time. You know, I could use Kevin's help here. Great. Thank you, Kevin.
There you go.
So for centuries, seafarers have traversed the Pacific Masterflow, crossing and traversing almost 25 million square kilometers, 1/5 of the Earth's surface. And these mariners have been exceptional. And they also sailed during a time when much of Europe still believed that the Earth was flat, using a science and art we know as wayfinding, which synthesizes seemingly unrelated bits of data, patterns in nature, in order to gain the keenest accuracy. These mariners are not unlike our astronauts. Their sea, our space, their canoes, our capsules. And we cannot overestimate the brilliance of this science. And among the greatest wayfinders of our time was a Micronesian navigator priest whose name was Pius Mau Piailu. Mau was beloved in Hawaii and the Pacific. He was a teacher of navigators Nainoa Thompson, Shorty Bertleman, and many others. Mau was also my mentor for 10 years, and it is to him that I dedicate these remarks. It's because of Mau that I set sail on my own journey. After my studies, I graduated with a PhD in cultural anthropology, as Devin mentioned, with a specialization in ethno-navigation. And shortly thereafter became an explorer for National Geographic and began traveling extensively. And in my travels, I lived with many tribes throughout the world. And one of those tribes were the Moken. They are sea nomads. Thank you. We'll advance this, if we may. Kevin, could you advance the slide for me? This is my mentor, Mau, with whom I studied. This, in fact, was an expedition that I had led to his island of Sarawak the last time I saw him. I was both grateful to have been with him on his island. And there were many quite extraordinary experiences that happened here, because on Sadawal, as with a close cluster of these islands in Micronesia, were the highest concentration of Palu, of navigator priests, of which Mao was. And I knew that this was the last time that I would be with my teacher. And so it was bittersweet. And at the same time, I had promised him that I would come and help record. And so we were with Mao and his family before he left, and where he conducted the post ceremony, the initiation ceremony for Nainoa, Shorty Burleman, and others. So it was quite an experience. Kevin, if you would forward. Here are the Moken. The Moken, as I mentioned, are sea nomads. And what's most extraordinary about them and fascinated me most about them is that in 2004, when the tsunami devastated most of Southeast Asia, this small tribe of about 2,000 nomads of the sea somehow were unscathed. And I wanted to understand why. What is it that they did? How were they able to anticipate the danger? And how were they able to protect their families and their community? And so I traveled to Thailand and then went south and went into the Andaman Sea to live with them, which was quite an extraordinary experience. And what I learned from them is that the principles they lived by were very similar to that of my mentor, Mao. And these were the three that were most outstanding and similar to Mao. One was they cultivate a heightened state of awareness, heightened perception. Two, they had an intimate and reverent relationship to the natural world. And three, they, through their lives, cultivated a very humble mastery and love for the ocean. Bear in mind that this culture, because they live on the ocean, though the Thai government is trying to encourage and in fact insist that they live more on land, because they're nomadic and nomads of the sea, the ocean, this watery seascape, is their home. It is their sanctuary and refuge. It is their university. It is their refrigerator. It is the birthplace of their children and grandchildren. And it is also their burial ground. And so it was a great privilege to live with them. And together with the wisdom that I learned from Mao and the Moken tribe of the Andaman Sea, along with many other cultures and communities that I have lived with over the decade, I have learned three things that I continue to share with leadership, with global leadership and their organizations. Next slide, please. And it is this: we must shift our perceptions and become much more aware of the world around us. In fact, in order to cultivate a relationship with the natural world, we must really begin to live very intimately with all of life, to re-examine our values so that wisdom has equal measure to our wealth. I mean, it's so interesting that we measure wealth in currency, but wouldn't it be wonderful if one day our wealth is measured by the wisdom that we have and the wisdom that we share with one another? And thirdly, to cultivate meaning in a world that is often devoid of it. Next slide, please. At a symposium at the National Geographic, we did something quite interesting. We gathered a group of leading environmentalists, and we laid out a map and identified all of the environmental hotspots throughout the world. And then with a separate map, together with leading linguists, social scientists, anthropologists, and cultural leaders, we identified all of the cultural hotspots around the world, measured by loss of language, loss of tradition, acculturation. And then we layered loss of lands, and then we layered the two maps together. and we found that they were almost identical. And as a Native Hawaiian scientist, it did not surprise me. But what it did was validate that where our lands are at risk, cultures in those regions are also vulnerable. The two cannot be separated. And yet we often talk about conservation of environment and not always give equal measure to conservation of cultural knowledge and wisdom. And the two are so necessary in their partnership because they give us a greater and more holistic perspective. And so I found it incredibly interesting. Next slide, please. Because it goes back to these teachings. As a child, as Devon was saying, I was raised, my parents were educators. My father was a genealogist in Hawaii and throughout the Pacific. And during the day, while they taught at university, they left us in the care of these three Hawaiian elders, these three old women. And these women were among the greatest environmentalists that I have ever known. They knew the names of the winds and the rains, planted and fished according to lunar cycles. We would go to the ocean as a child and they would chant the fish under very specific moons. They would chant fish and you could see the fish coming toward shore. And these old women would go into the ocean knee-high with their mu'umu'us and use the hem of their dresses to gather only what we needed and nothing more. And then we would mahalo the ocean and we'd go and prepare the food, never taking any more than what we needed. And they were such tremendous stewards of the environment. But this is the quality and the degree of an intimate relationship that I have watched throughout my career of these cultures, that they had this absolute reverence for the natural world. They saw, in fact, the natural world as part of their family, an extended part of their family. And this is so critical in order to be a good steward and a good environmentalist. Next slide, please. Dr. Wade Davis eloquently speaks to this, where he says there is a fire burning over the earth, taking with it plants and animals, ancient skills and visionary wisdom, quelling this flame, this spreading inferno, and rediscovering a new appreciation for the diversity of the human spirit as expressed by culture is among the central challenges of our time. One of the sad facts is many of these elders, who are the equivalent in terms of our libraries of knowledge, to me, they represent our libraries of Alexandria, and they are passing away all too rapidly. And so my work has been devoted to supporting many, many cultures around the world in helping them record and protect the wisdom and systems of knowledge within their communities. So we're working with the San Bushmen, the elders. There are only less than a handful left, and many elders like them around the world. Next slide, please. And then together with these communities, we are creating a digital repository, one that is self-determined, where these cultures within themselves determine what parts of their wisdom and knowledge are shared. They determine who they pass this wisdom and knowledge on to. And, you know, it's quite a humbling experience to live with them, because many of them have experienced, like I have as a child growing up, that people come into our communities and extract wisdom and knowledge and leave to continue their projects. And much of it is used, and sometimes we never see it again. So it's important that we also become a part of this process of creating a repository of this knowledge that these cultures, that the elders can then determine how it is used, where it is used, and to whom it is passed on. And so in closing, next slide, please. In closing, the fact remains that we are all Indigenous, all of us. There is a place and a lineage that if we research, we will find and discover that our ancestors held valuable knowledge and wisdom. And I would encourage all of us to go into our families, into our communities, to sit with elders, to record their stories for them, to ensure that their voices will last for generations to come, that the children that are not yet born will someday hear their voices and their chants, their visions and their dreams. One of the closing parts of my time with my Hawaiian elders is that they shared this prophecy that I would like to share with you. They said at the close of the new dawn, which we knew to be the century that they passed, and so they said it on the eve of the new dawn, which we know to be this time, but at the close of the previous chapter, during this period of time, at the beginning and rise of this new dawn, which we know to be the 21st century, the world will be in trouble, and it will take the wisdom from the far edges of the earth to return the world to balance. They predicted in great detail much of what we're experiencing right now. And one of the things that they said to me during their prophecy, which is very similar to many of the prophecies shared by other cultures, all of these predictions are uncannily similar wherever I travel to. But one of the things my elders said, and I was 7 at the time, they said, if you choose to, because you always have choice, you will go far away to keep the voices of the ancestors alive. And it will sometimes be a lonely road, but as you travel, you will look into the eyes of seeming strangers, and there you will find your ohana, your family. And it will take all of you to return the world to balance. So I encourage all of us to cultivate the wisdom within us, within our families, within our communities, within our regions of the world, that wealth may someday be measured in wisdom rather than in the size of our portfolios and belongings. As Mao said, the planet is our canoe, and the canoe our planet. How we use these resources, how we cultivate these resources are up to us. The mantle has now been passed, and we are now the navigators. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay. That was a just incredibly fascinating talk that presents a whole different angle of work that originated in the Pacific from your native homeland of Hawaii, and what you perhaps learned as a young girl that, as they said, would drive you eventually to talk to other parts of the world. And so I think it's really fascinating to end on that note that it's you know, it's going to take not just a village this time, it's going to take the whole world, right? And what I love about this group tonight is that each, you know, I would say one, but Amber and Emily sort of putting you together with your work that is tied to each other. And Dr. Lindsay and Captain Danaher, what I love is that each one of you is discovering, exploring, and teaching things that are on a different plane, but all come together with the same common goal, which is to communicate information from elders of the past, ancestral knowledge, and in Lynn's case, to try to understand history in a more complex way so that we might then apply what we learned from that history to problems facing our world today. And then Amber and Emily with the research and the consulting that you're doing, which is on a very present day level. Let's look at, you know, you're saying, let's look at present day issues and research them and assess how we might be able to come together to actually also improve the world from a very present day commonalities. So I love that put together. I feel like you all really, you could all take the world by storm. So don't be afraid if you get a lot of people following you and wanting to know more about what you've done. But again, the Pacific being as vast as she is, I like to call her Lady the Pacific. I love, again, that you all have brought such diverse topics to the table, yet diverse topics that ultimately all point towards a common goal, which is that we really do have to protect and appreciate this world that we are not the owners of, that we are simply a part of, just as much as a blade of grass to a grasshopper to, you know, an ocean whale to a sloth, one of my favorite animals. We're all equal, and I love that. I love everything that you all brought to the table tonight. So thank you so much, all of you, for this wonderful, wonderful evening. So we do have a Q&A that we will launch into very shortly. Before that, though, I do want to remind everybody that tomorrow night we have another program. It's actually not part of the Women 40th Anniversary Committee, but it is a great program called Walk with Nature, Safely and Respectfully, that's presented by the Explorers Club and one of our great sponsors, Fall Raven, the Walk with Nature Speakers Series. So tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern, June 23rd, Wednesday, tomorrow, June 23rd, that program will air. And then also please stay tuned for upcoming Women's Committee events. The next one will be Women in Archaeology, hosted by Danae Buckingham on July 20th. And the one following that will be Women Who Defend the Wild, hosted by Katie Bosler on August 24th. And actually I have two more little messages that I want to get out there, which is, the first is, please mark your calendars for the Pathfinders Symposium taking place on November 5th and 6th. It's organized and hosted by the Women's 40th Committee, and we will be screening the final cut of the Women's Pathfinders film, in addition to hosting several really fascinating speakers who are all women members of the Explorers Club as well, over that 2-day symposium. If you're interested in presenting, please submit an application. The information can be found on the flyer, the PR release for this evening, if you haven't yet found it. And lastly, lady members, if you haven't already filled out the survey, please do so we can continue to keep track of our wonderful women members of the club. All right, so we will now go into our Q&A portion of the evening. And
Devin, may I make a comment?
Absolutely, please do.
I would like to thank Dr. Lindsay from the bottom of my heart, because she spoke the true meaning of aloha. Truly.
Yes.
Malama honua, which means caring for the earth. And I think it was beautiful, and I was moved by your talk.
Oh, mahalo then. And I have a question for, not a question, but just a deep bow of gratitude for the work that you're doing. And I want to make sure that other people are able to speak with you about non-Madal, but I went before I saw Papa Mau. I would like to talk with you about that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And
anytime.
Yeah, please. And Lynn, thank you so much for saying that. I also could not have put my appreciation any better than you just did for Dr. Lindsay. So if any one of you has any comments or questions for each other, feel free to just jump in. We're kind of just going to have a conversation here about anything that came to mind or was of interest or curiosity or confusion. And then we do have some questions from our audience this evening as well. But I'll offer it up to you all first on our panel tonight, in case there's anything you were dying to say first. Otherwise, we'll go straight to questions.
Oh, I would love to, if I may start. I would love to know where we can follow Lynn's work, because archaeoastronomy was really my first, where I was going to do my specialization. And when there wasn't enough information and research that I could find from our oral traditions, I moved into ethno-navigation. So how do we follow Lynn's work and further about non-Medall?
Well, I have a website, pacificislandsresearchinstitute.org, and all of our reports are there on all the work we've done, very complete. Most of them written in part by Alexandra and Edmundo Edwards, who are two of the experts in the field from Rapa Nui on archaeoastronomy. So I would be happy to put you in touch with either one of them personally.
Oh, I just love the work that you're doing. Congratulations, bravo. I'm so excited, so excited. I wanted to say that we went to non-Medall prior to going to Sadawal. And then when we got to Sadawal, I asked Mao about the stones of non-Medall. And he shared quite an interesting myth regarding non-Medall, and that it came from the sky and from the heavens and so forth. So I look forward to sharing all of that with you at another time. But thank you again for your...
I would love to hear it, because I'm all about the myths of non-Medall. I'm collecting them. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I have a question for Lynn and Dr. Elizabeth. I am just curious, what, from your perspective, what do you think is the greatest challenge that's facing the Pacific today?
That's a very good question. From my perspective, because I spent a fair amount of time throughout the Pacific in Aotearoa, Vanuatu, New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga, I would say that in many of these areas, including Sadawal, where Mao was from, is an indoctrination and an enculturation of the people, and a marginalization of the immense wisdom and knowledge that these cultures and their traditions have. And it concerns me the most, because we see generations, including in Hawaii, where until our cultural renaissance, we almost became silent in many ways, where I can speak directly about Hawaii, but I've seen the same pattern throughout the Pacific and other parts of the world, where it wasn't safe to practice some of our traditions and our ways of life. And some of that knowledge was not passed on. And it concerns me because of the urgency to conserve this knowledge and wisdom, because I feel it's so necessary for these complex times. And that would, to me, would be our greatest challenge, is conservation of wisdom and knowledge.
And I would like to add to that I think that the single most significant element of the entire Pacific, the Polynesian and Micronesian Pacific, becoming aware of the importance of their own culture is the Polynesian voyaging canoe, Hokulea. That cannot be overstated. When that voyaging canoe first sailed to Tahiti, everyone, the entire bay was full of thousands of people. And it reinforced the ancient beliefs that these were skilled navigators. But up until that moment, they didn't have the confidence in their culture, the confidence in their history, the confidence in their wayfinding skills. And that was, it metamorphosized the entire Polynesian and Micronesian culture.
Yes,
and I can't say enough for the importance of the Hokulea and the Polynesian Voyaging Society in terms of the importance of their contribution to the Renaissance of native cultures in the Pacific. It's just, now there are canoes from the Cook Islands, from the Marquesas, from Samoa, you would know, Dr. Lindsay.
Tahiti, yes, throughout the Pacific, Samoa. Right. You know, you're absolutely right, Lynn. It was a turning point in the Pacific. A cultural renaissance happened. Our knowledge, our language, our, Hokulea mark, and has been a guiding light through the Pacific and a source of great inspiration in now the world. So thank you for saying that.
Yes, absolutely. And what I notice now too is when you get on a Hawaiian Airlines flight and they're giving you the talk about fasten your seatbelts, they also give it in Hawaiian.
Yes.
which I am forever grateful, because to me, listening to the Hawaiian language it's so melodic and it's so beautiful that it warms my heart to hear it spoken.
Yes, and within it, just like archaeoastronomy, the language is coded, just like Sanskrit. So you can start to take parts of words apart and you see where the codes and the wisdoms are and the knowledge is embedded, which is fascinating.
It is. It is.
That was really beautiful. I love both of your responses there. And it definitely hits home because following our expedition, we had the opportunity to sit down with some elders and learn about their history and their relationships with the whales, what that used to look like. And then we have new conversations with this new generation, this group of young people that live in a totally different world than their grandparents or their ancestors did. And it was a really special time because I really saw the power of storytelling and communicating, and how that could be so powerful for the newer generation. So in your opinions, how can we preserve these stories in the most effective ways and share it with the people who need to hear it, those who are actually in these communities and living on the islands or, within those spaces? How do we get that information to them?
I'm just going to jump in quickly and add to that great question, Amber. We have a question from one of our audience members, from Luna Shao, and I apologize, Luna, if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But to add to your question, Amber, she poses the question to you and Emily, saying, following Dr. Lindsay's thoughts on conserving local culture, rethinking the questions Emily and Amber raised regarding the sustainability of ecotourism. How do we prevent the loss of traditional skills and culture when Indigenous people at Tonga, for example, become tourist guides, etc.? So I wanted to just add that in there because I think that's another sort of angle to the question that you're asking, Amber. And I think, Dr. Lindsay or, please, everybody feel free to weigh in on that.
Sure, it's important within communities that these younger generations really remember who they are, because it's as Lynn was talking about earlier in terms of our cultural renaissance, it's a personal renaissance that we come back to the greatness that has existed. The many cultures say we walk in the shadow of giants, meaning that our ancestors had these great systems of knowledge and wisdom, and that we must remember them again and embody them. And so it's important, and if people are involved in tourism of any kind, that they first deeply and intimately know their own culture. And an example of this, a very good example of this, was Pilahipaki, who wanted to know more about her culture. She's deceased now, but she really went in search of what aloha meant, as Lynn was talking about, and was involved in tourism at a point in her life. And she studied with the elders, and then she began to understand that Hawaii, that aloha held a key to its wisdom for the world. And so as these cultures really come to reacquaint themselves and recollect their memories, their stories, their chants, their histories, they begin to embody this wisdom, and it becomes much more robust and vital within them, and everything blossoms from that. But then we really become healthy stewards. And when we talk about ecotourism, we're talking about healthy stewardship. And there are many ways to conserve knowledge. It's important that when we go into these communities, that one, our intentions are very good, that we know that we're conserving for these communities. In my experience, I walk very humbly. Everything I record, I give to the community, and they determine how they would like it to be used. So I will spend all of my resources to record on their behalf, make sure that it's protected, and then hand everything over to them, and they decide what they would like to do with it.
I think that's really an important point, because part of my research has been studying these ancient sites And what is truly amazing is when you go deep into the jungle and you visit these extraordinary sites, not only places like Namandal, but the terracing, the intricate terracing that they were able to build in Raivavai, in the Aso group, and all the different islands. Hawaii had an amazing system of moving water, of creating these incredibly fertile places to plant taro and raise shrimp and manage their resources. So it's really about managing their resources carefully and respectfully. And that's the thing that is, I think, sort of lost in the modern world in terms of the local folks, because they don't really understand what their ancestors were able to accomplish. And one of the projects that some of you might know Trevor Wallace is working on in Hawaii is they're uncovering some of these sites in Hawaii that I didn't even know on Kauai they existed. They had an amazing aqueduct that came from the mountain down to the southern part of Kauai. And it's astounding the different types of things that they were able to build and manage their resources in a very careful way. And I just, I think that that's really integral. And I love it when I see a lot of young folks, they're helping clear and clean. And it's inspiring because they are then learning about their own culture as well. So it's also being experiential on the ground. Plus on Kauai, there's a huge fish pond. There's a whole group of young people and a group of local folks that are recreating the fish ponds on the North Shore of Kauai. So there's some really wonderful things going on in terms of recreating or restoring, if you will, these extraordinarily important ancient sites. So that's also part of the storytelling.
Along those lines, may I add this? There's a brilliant, when we talk about ethnomimicry, about systems of knowledge and processes based on ancestral knowledge and wisdom, that this is a very good example. In India and South India, through the, I believe, 9th to 15th century, they built these architectural masterpieces, and they call them step ponds or step wells. And then they fell into disrepair when the British colonized India. And what's interesting now is that architectural firms in Europe are going back to look at these beautiful works of art that were once used as reservoirs where they gathered and harvested water during the monsoons and used them during the dry seasons. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel because these cultures had brilliant systems that we just have to go back and study our ethnomimicry as we do our biomimicry.
I think in Tonga, what we see is a culture in transition. One of the greatest fears that a lot of the elder Tongans had was, so many of the younger generations are leaving because they're seeking new opportunities, seeking ways to benefit financially, and they're seeking ways to move into a more modern world. That being said, our relationship with the Tongans, what we appreciated the most was the Tongans we stayed with are incredibly close to their families on the island of Hunga, which was the island right off of where we were staying. And we went and visited with the elders, and one of the elders was one of the generation who had previously hunted the whales in the Hokulea, which was the sailboat that they would use to hunt these whales. And what was most surprising to me was the fact that he talked about whales as, I always almost assumed, I guess wrongly assumed, that there was more of a spiritual connection with these whales, just because they are, such a large and intelligent animal. But for them, it was a source of meat, and they called them large fish, and that was a really important source of income for them. And most of the villagers we talked to remembered eating the meat. Most of them wanted to see whale hunting come back. And it becomes an interesting question and an interesting dynamic of where's the balance? Because you don't want to lose that culture. There was no more Kaleas in use left. There was none on the island. And the last people that had hunted on them were just a handful who even remembered how to build these structures. And so it became a really interesting question to think about. There's such a element of, you want to protect these whales, you want to conserve these whales, but how do you preserve that culture that also really found importance in hunting them. And I think that was a really interesting question for us to examine and learn more about, and really think about from a more conscious perspective, and not one of, coming as outsiders and having your own perceptions of how this should be, but how do the Tongans feel about this program, and how are they transitioning into a modern world in a way that they can maintain their cultures and also maintain their youth so that they're not leaving, because that's a major, major issue in Tonga right now.
Mhm. Yeah. It's an issue throughout the world, in fact. And relationship to whales, we find that in different cultures, of course, Emily, there's much to learn about these relationships. There were generations of what were known as whale women, and quite extraordinary. There are none left alive. I would be curious to know about the generations previous to these elders and their relationship, because I think sometimes there are gaps of our knowledge and understanding that we begin to lose over time. And I would be so interested in going even further back in research, knowing the myths and cultures of their relationship with the whales.
Yeah, that would truly be fascinating to take it, generation 2, 3, 4, 5 back further to understand what the relationship was, because perhaps there was an element to their survival that they did have to rely on the whales, but perhaps they had more of a spiritual connection to the whales at that same time, in addition to relying on them for their own survival. So I think that's true. There are possibilities of so many different stories that would come from the generational stories. And what I love about that too, Emily, I recall you or Amber, I can't remember, I'm sorry, which one of you talked a little bit in some of our prior meetings about how that whale watcher, the whale hunters, if that's the right term, son is now an leads these eco tours. And I think that's an interesting, I don't want to be the judge of whether we could say things have come full circle, because perhaps they haven't, but again, I'm not really the one to judge that. But I do think it's really interesting that we, hopefully we could go back and study further in the past and bring more knowledge to the present day to address our present day issues, using, as Dr. Lindsay and Captain Danaher have been saying, using the knowledge from our elders, where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We may just need to relearn it and adapt it to present day issues. So yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. Very interesting topic. We have so many questions, people. I don't know if we're going to get through all of these, so I apologize to those of you who have sent questions if we don't get to them. Before I move on though from those, did any of our current panelists have any more to say on these fascinating topics that we're sort of conversing about? Our coffee talk, so to speak.
I'd just like to say that all the women on this panel that I've had the pleasure of sharing this panel with are an inspiration. So I just want you to all know that.
Thank you, Lynn. You and you know that I gush over you and Dr. Tilburg and Dr. Lindsay. Now that I know her, I gush over all the inspiration that you've given me, and all the work that you all have done in the islands of the Pacific have really meant a lot to me. And I love the work that Emily and Amber are also doing. It's just it's endlessly interesting. So we have a few more minutes. I think we can address a couple of these questions here. Let's see. We did touch a little bit on this topic. Dr. Lindsay and Captain Danaher, you were speaking about the masonry and the art form that it is, and the knowledge and the efficiency of the structures that were built. So somebody, I'm not sure who asked this, Lynn, of you, but the person said, could you tell us some more about the masonry techniques you found in Nan Madol? And I'm not
That's a real mystery, I can tell you that. I mean, they're like Elizabeth said, there are, they came from the sky. There was also myths of them singing the stones into place. There were red dragons that carried the stones into place. It's mind-boggling when you see the size of these basalt, columnar basalt. So it's still, the jury's out. We haven't even been able to really confirm the quarry where they came from. We found two places, one on Kosharai, one on Emmendale, where we think it was the quarry. But there's no way of knowing for sure without doing more digging and excavating and doing, isotope analysis and whatever with the different basalts. But there is some columnar basalts in different locations that could have been a source of some of the material, but the material itself is, when you think about the fact that there are 92 structures and some of them are 40 feet high, you can't even get your mind around it. And it took a lot of folks, if it was by human power or red dragons or flying saucers and all of the other there are some pretty silly myths. But I think in truth, it was just a lot of manpower and a lot of rhythmic movement by a lot of guys to move them. And so somebody had a lot of control, and it's mind-boggling. I can't say anything more than that. When you see the size of these columnar, just one makes the moai of Easter Island look like children's play.
Really?
When you think about the weight of these stones and the number of the stones. So yeah, it's extraordinary. And just like you were saying, Elizabeth, about the step wells, I know those were so phenomenal architecturally, and that's a really good reason for any young explorers that wanted to go back to Namandal and do more research. I highly encourage it. I think it's just, we're barely scraping the moss off the rocks. There's a lot of work to be done there. It's a fascinating place. If you like hot weather, good place to go.
That's amazing. That's incredible to think that they make the moai of Easter Island look, small. That's just mind blowing to me. Having my mind already blown by the size of the moai when I actually got to Rapa Nui. It's that's just phenomenal. I can't even.
Pretty extraordinary what ancient man has been able to. Like the pyramids. It's extraordinary. So really, I wish I had a better answer. There's no masonry, by the way, which indicates mortar. It's simply bare stone stacked on bare stone.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Another question we had, this is sort of switching topics again, but I think it's actually an interesting question for everybody, though it was posted for Dr. Lindsay. And that is, Deborah Ward said to you, this feels like a spiritual journey. Is that how you feel? And
what a beautiful question.
Yeah.
Deborah, thank you. I do think that, at least in my experience, we are never the same. We make these expeditions, we travel, we learn and we evolve, and we are changed intimately. And with every culture that I have had the privilege of being with, there was absolutely an aspect of the spirit, of a deep knowing, a deep wisdom. I would always say, our hearts are our most accurate compasses. And, there's a lot more to be said about that. But Deborah, that was a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's lovely. I don't know, Amber, Emily, or Lynn, if any one of you wants to comment on that and how exploration, what it does to you, why you do it in the first place, and what it means to you, and what it's like during an expedition, or what it feels like when you come back.
Well, for me, an expedition in these different regions is a privilege. It's a privilege to spend time with the folks on the islands who have always shown us the most extraordinary, welcoming, they're just so generous. and so loving. And I have not had, and I've been to a lot of islands in the Pacific, and all of them have been warm, generous, loving. And when I left Raivavai, I had leis stacked up over my head, a homemade hat they made. I mean, they made me promise to come back. I mean, it's amazing to be embraced by the local culture, and they share their life, lots of good breadfruit and taro, which I love. And so you get to eat a lot of the good local food and appreciate their culture. And there's things going on that you wish weren't happening, but at the same time, they remain true, at least in some of these remote islands, like Raivavai, like Koshirai. These people remain true to their cultures as close as they can at this point in time. They're still raising their ancestral crops, and still practicing a lot of their ancient culture. And so that's, to me, is just, it's so enlightening, and I just feel privileged. I can't express it more greatly than that. I just feel really, really privileged to be in their presence and hear their stories. And they do dances for us. And I mean, we're not tourists. We're living in Funkyville. You know, we're living in some pretty rough conditions. And I mean, they give gifts. I just can't say enough. It's just that generous aloha spirit that you will find throughout the Pacific, because the key to aloha is to give aloha. And if you give aloha and respect, you get it back quadruplicate every single time. And it's wonderful to be in a culture that understands and appreciates that and extends that gratitude for the same gratitude you extend. So it is a spiritual journey. It is totally a spiritual journey all the way. That's why I live in Hawaii.
I love that, Lynn. I completely echo that sentiment of gratitude, and what a privilege it is to be able to explore and experience these other cultures and communities. I would say that it's also a huge source of inspiration for me in the work that I do, going out and exploring and meeting other cultures and people and having these experiences. It's the fuel for the fire, keeps us going and wanting to learn more and find new and innovative ways to conserve and protect not only our environment, but our culture and our heritage. And that is what keeps me coming back for more.
I think for me, I think you start to, go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, I just wanted to share a real quick story. Many years ago, there was an explorer in the 1920s in the small island in the Australs called Raivavai, and he was loaned a book, which was the book of all the records of that had been written by the missionaries of who owned what land. And he took that book back to the Bishop Museum. And from that point on, it was like 1922. From that point on, there was all this discord about who owned what, where was, who moved that rock, because that was my corner. And there was all this discord because there wasn't an accurate record. And years later, my friend Edmundo was at the Bishop Museum, and he found the book, and he made a copy of the book. And when we went to Raivavai, we took them a copy of that book. And you cannot imagine being able to find that precious piece of information that they had thought they had lost, and be able to return it to this tiny island in the Pacific. They were able to sort out all kinds of disputes. Some of them found out they owned land in Raiatea. I mean, it was like they had a huge party for us. And it's that kind of sharing. And this was towards the end of our stay. So it was so wonderful to be able to share that kind of experience with them, and to actually bring them really valuable information that they could then benefit from, that had been recorded. And they did a lot of recording of amazing, I mean, the missionaries, I have to give the missionaries some credit in Raivavai specifically, because they recorded a lot of the myths and the legends and the way they did things, from making spears to making canoes to planting, harvesting, how to make a taro punch that you punch in the ground to plant your taro. I mean, it was extraordinary what they were able to do. So finding those pieces of their culture and being able to share it with them, it was phenomenal. So that is really satisfying when you can give back to the culture what they thought they had lost. So anyway.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary thing. It really is. It
Yeah.
really is. Emily, you were going to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to add on to it. I think everybody's really captured, the spirit of exploration. I think for me, the spirit of exploration, sometimes it's so easy to feel like the world is getting smaller. I think especially now with how connected we are over the internet and Zoom and everything. But I think when you go on an expedition and you meet new people and you explore new ecosystems, you're reminded of how big the world still is and how much we still have to learn and explore and discover. And I think for me, that's what really ignites my passion for exploration.
I think that's all so true. And what I love about everything that you all have said about exploration, to me, kind of to really not summarize everything, because as we've discussed, this is a very diverse group of women with a diverse group of focal points for their studies. But for the Explorers Club moving forward, I'm a new board member of the club, and one thing that's become very clear to us now is that it's very important to define exploration for this new century, and to define exploration in a way that makes sense for the world that we're living in currently, which of course is very different than the world of 1904, which was when the club was originally established. We're honoring women. We've had women members now for 40 years. The world is in one way a smaller place, to Emily's point, but also isn't a smaller place, to Emily's point. And I love that Lynn's idea about giving back. Exploration is not about exploitation. It is about a sharing of ideas and ideals and learning from each other, learning from our elders, as Dr. Lindsay has discussed, and learning from each other. And I think that it's really interesting to me, knowing that this is a topic that the board will be discussing. It's interesting to think about what each one of you has said this evening, and also what many of the questions brought up, points that the questions raised as well. So I'm so grateful to everybody who participated on this panel tonight. Thank you so much. Wonderful ladies of the Explorers Club. And thank you so much to the people who joined us this evening on our remote chat, whether it was YouTube or Facebook or explorers.org. We're so delighted with all the questions and the interaction. And I apologize immensely to those of you whose questions we didn't have the time to answer, but we are officially out of time. So I don't want to get in trouble, and I will have to sign us off here. Please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to contact any of the speakers directly, or you can reach out to them directly, I'm sure, as well, with your remaining questions that, again, I apologize we did not have the time to get to. So with that, one last big thanks to Kevin for getting us up to speed here and working with us to make sure we were going to get everything done. And many thanks again to Milbury, our fearless leader, to Will Roseman, Richard Weiss, Richard Garriott, Brittany Barbazat, Nancy and Dave for helping me fill this panel with wonderful people who I may not have known, to Dr. Davis, and to also Lacey, who is our archivist at the club, and to anyone else who, I apologize if I've forgotten your name, but you are a club employee and therefore keep this whole ship afloat. So thank you everybody so much. And again, thanks so much to our panelists for a really fun evening.
Aloha.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.